Why are we looking for reasons to keep hundreds of thousands of Americans and atomic weapons in the heart of Europe?
Talking about
the idea is to get us out.
Just a reasonable...
The art of arguing has become a national pastime.
Morality thing is...
From TV talk shows...
Sit there and say we have to accept immorality because that's just the way it is.
No, we don't.
To issue-oriented programming.
Mandela's release. How long can apartheid last now?
To talk radio.
You're just left with all this graphic imagery.
There are literally hundreds of forums available nationwide to air opposing views.
That we need to have a more consistent, balanced policy in the Middle East.
Writing an argumentative essay is a lot like taking one side of an issue on a talk show.
And it's difficult. We haven't, frankly, had a very consistent policy in the Middle East with regard to standing up against occupation.
Except, of course, you are doing it on paper. And because your dialogue is with a piece of paper instead of another person, you have no one to argue with. When you write an argumentative paper, then, you need to account for the other point of view yourself. Before you even pick a topic for an argumentative paper, you should know the difference between an arguable statement and a non-arguable one. Basically, an arguable statement attempts to convince readers of something or change their minds about an issue. It should address a problem for which no easy solution exists, pose a question to which there is no absolute answer, or take a position with which readers can disagree. Look at these two statements. Which one do you think is an arguable one and which is not?
The large amounts of money awarded to victims in malpractice suits are driving up doctors' insurance premiums and leading to spiraling health care costs. The enormous number of lawsuits in this country is getting out of hand and is costing society as a whole.
With which of these statements can you take issue? There isn't much doubt that the first statement is accurate as it stands. High malpractice awards are indeed driving up insurance costs and, in turn, the cost of health care. There may be other reasons why health care costs are rising, but clearly the amounts awarded in malpractice suits is a major one. Since you can't have an argument without something to argue about, this statement doesn't appear to fit our criteria. The second statement, however, can be argued both ways. Some people believe the many lawsuits in recent years are welcome. Years ago, patients had little or no recourse if they suffered an unnecessary loss. People simply accepted the outcomes because doctors were considered almost infallible. But today, because attitudes about suing doctors have changed, patients are more protected.
So I'm going to go ahead and give you a prescription. And would you like a note for your job?
Yeah, I need one to get back to work.
And let us know if you're not getting better.
Okay.
The second statement, then, presents more than one way to look at the issue. The second statement, therefore, fits the requirement of being an arguable statement. In an argumentative paper, the thesis, of course, must present an arguable statement. You can turn a neutral statement into an arguable one by simply revising it. For example, jet lag is the bane of intercontinental travelers. This statement is hard to argue. It is an accepted fact that most people who travel abroad experience jet lag. However, if you comment on this, then you are stating an opinion which can be argued. Because jet lag is the bane of most intercontinental travelers, airlines should fund research to eliminate the problem. Now you have a thesis which can be debated. In addition to writing an arguable thesis, you also need to identify your audience. This is an important step in preparing just about any kind of essay or paper. However, it is especially important in writing a persuasive paper because knowing whom you're trying to convince will help you know how to write your argument. How sophisticated is your audience about this subject already? Do they need to have the basic concepts and terms defined for them? Or are they so expert in the field already that you have to use technical terminology and concepts? Understanding your audience helps you decide which points to emphasize in order to be more persuasive. For example, suppose you're writing a paper in favor of mandatory drug testing in the workplace. Your arguments are that drug abuse on the job causes more accidents, that it results in lower productivity, it is responsible for employee theft and increased mistakes, and ultimately is a greater cost to the employer. These are all good reasons. However, depending on your audience, these reasons may not be convincing. If you're trying to convince employees to undergo drug testing, these reasons will more than likely be met with automatic resistance. An employee reading your essay will no doubt feel, that's all well and good for the employer, but what's in it for me? After all, an employee stands to lose his or her job if the test shows, however erroneously, that there is evidence of drugs. How then do you convince this audience that drug testing can actually benefit them? Look again at your original list. Drug abuse on the job causes more accidents, lower productivity, employee theft and mistakes, and ultimately is a greater cost to the employer. What do these issues mean to the employee? Well, first of all, if there are more accidents on the job as a result of drug abuse, then you could argue that drug testing would create a safer environment to work in. Secondly, every time an employer loses money from theft or mistakes or lower productivity, employers have to make up the cost somewhere. Layoffs, budget cuts, a reduction of health care benefits, or even going out of business are possible outcomes. Ultimately, any of these directly affects the employee. So you could argue, weeding out employees who abuse drugs will save money for the company and ultimately offer greater job security for the workers who stay. By the same token, your original argument may not be effective if your audience is largely employers. This is like preaching to the choir. That is, you're trying to convince a group of people that are already convinced. Most employers probably agree with your reasons for drug testing, even though they may not want to institute a program in their own company. There are other considerations as well. Employers may be concerned about getting sued by employees who fail the test, or they might be worried about the accuracy of the test. Your argument then could address those issues, rather than going on and on about the merits of drug testing. So understanding your audience most definitely affects the way you present the pros and cons of an issue. If you don't consider your audience, you may present wonderful arguments, but you may very well fail to sway your readers because you have not addressed their concerns or needs. Another consideration in writing the argumentative paper is establishing credibility. You can do this by demonstrating your knowledge of the subject, establishing a common ground, and demonstrating fairness to the opposing side or sides. There are several ways to demonstrate your knowledge of a subject. First, there is the extensiveness of your research and the variety of sources you cite. The credibility of your sources helps demonstrate your knowledge as well.
Check it out. I found the perfect reference.
Depending on the subject, your personal experience with a topic can also serve to reinforce your credibility, provided you don't let personal biases blur your perceptions. If, for example, you or any of your coworkers ever experienced sexual harassment on the job, then putting that experience into an essay on sexual harassment shows the reader you know firsthand what you're talking about. If, however, you use that experience to advocate that any boss who sexually harasses an employee should be publicly exposed or fired, then you're letting your personal feelings creep into your argument, and this should be avoided. Another method of establishing credibility is to establish a common ground. That is, you can cite those aspects of an argument on which all sides agree. Few people would argue that sexual harassment on the job is good.
You know you are tied for this promotion, but I'm sure that I could rule in your favor if you were to say, visit me at my town apartment tonight.
Or, in the drug testing example, that drug-related accidents and theft need to be eliminated. In these areas, any reader will find your argument to be reasonable, regardless of what side they are on. Finally, you need to demonstrate fairness to the opposing side when writing an argumentative paper. This is not to say that you are arguing out of both sides of your mouth, but you do need to acknowledge or refute the other side. As we pointed out in the beginning of this program, arguing on paper is a one-sided affair. On TV or radio, or between two people, both sides of an argument are represented. But with a paper, because you are the only one talking, there is a tendency to ignore counter-arguments. To remedy this, you need to demonstrate to the reader that you have considered all points of view. In fact, you may even acknowledge sympathy or agreement with some of the points in the opposing argument. For example, in this essay on gun control, the writer takes the position that handguns should be banned and all firearms strictly regulated. He presents a good case, listing the loss of public figures, quoting statistics of numbers of people killed, and comparing those figures to the number of Americans killed in the Vietnam War. And he also acknowledges agreement with the opposing side.
Admittedly, guns do not cause crimes or violent disputes. This will happen whether there are guns or not. Guns don't kill people, people kill people.
The writer then goes on to use the opposing side to strengthen his own argument.
But why allow guns to become part of the equation? It only serves to make the outcome more deadly.
So you see, stating what the other side believes does not detract from or weaken your position. Instead, it allows you to refute contrary opinion and demonstrate how well your evidence holds up. This brings us to the essence of the argumentative essay, the proof of your thesis. The good argumentative paper is based on an appeal to logic. You can prove a point and arrive at a valid conclusion by following a certain prescribed route. There are two classical approaches to logical thinking, inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes from the specific to the general. That is, you cite several individual facts or observations which lead to a general conclusion in the end. You do this often in your everyday life. If you go to the refrigerator on a study break looking for a snack and discover the light doesn't come on when you open the door, you start looking for the reason. You might open the freezer and find that all the ice cubes have melted. Then you check the plug. Still plugged in. Well then, is the power out? You check the clock on the wall and compare that time with the time on your watch. Both show the same time. You conclude, therefore, that something must be wrong with the refrigerator itself. You have used inductive reasoning to reach your conclusion. Conclusions reached by inductive reasoning are not scientific experiments, but they should be based on as much information and data as possible. For example, if you didn't check the clock in the house against your watch, you might have concluded, erroneously, that the power was out. When writing an argumentative essay using inductive reasoning, the stronger or bolder your conclusion, the more evidence you will need to lead up to that conclusion. If you're advocating the death penalty, for example, you cannot cite only one case to argue that all criminals accused of murder should be executed. You need to cite several studies and quote more than one authority to support your position. You will have to come up with very strong arguments to provide counter-evidence that the death penalty is not a deterrent to crime. You may want to address why you feel other kinds of punishments are not strong enough, why you believe that the death penalty is needed. In essence, leave no stone unturned, because the more you include, the stronger your argument. The second kind of logical approach in posing an argument is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning moves from a fundamental truth, value, or right to a conclusion about a particular case. The essay begins with an accepted value or belief which establishes a common ground with the reader and paves the way for your argument. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most famous examples of deductive reasoning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Jefferson's essay begins with a generally accepted value, that everyone is entitled to equal treatment. The rest of his essay proceeds to demonstrate the many ways in which King George violated or ignored those rights. The conclusion reached at the end of the essay is that since King George broke faith with colonists' rights, the American colonies were no longer bound by allegiance to him and therefore could be declared independent and free states. Deductive reasoning starts with a premise, an assumed value which lies at the core of your argument. This value does not necessarily have to be absolute or provable. Many people even today take issue with the premise that all men are created equal. However, a premise does have to present an underlying assumption, and it does have to represent the author's beliefs. Using deductive reasoning, your essay on the death penalty, for example, could begin with the premise that all life is sacred. Even though you may feel that this statement is a basic universal truth, not all people will agree with this assumption. However, the statement does express a belief of many people and is therefore a valid premise. The argument that even murderers have a right to live, then, flows logically from this premise. If you agree that all life is sacred, then the death penalty should be abolished. While the deductive argument does provide evidence to support its conclusions, this type of essay is more concerned with defining the premise or the underlying assumption than with the argument. If your readers agree with your basic belief or premise, they're more likely to be persuaded by your argument and to agree with your final conclusion. Be careful, however, that when you formulate your premise, you don't let biased beliefs or incorrect assumptions guide your argument. Try to avoid this or you will leap to conclusions. For example, premise: all men are handy with tools. Fact: Alex is a man. Conclusion: therefore, Alex should know how to build our garage. The problem with this reasoning, obviously, is that not all men are handy with tools. Some, in fact, have never even used a screwdriver. An inaccurate premise in this case led to a faulty conclusion. In the examples used earlier, that all men are created equal or that all life is sacred, the assumptions may not have been arguable, but neither were they provable. You can, however, prove that many men are not handy with tools. This statement is faulty. Jumping to conclusions is one of several problems you may encounter when writing an argumentative essay. Mistakes like this are called logical fallacies and represent holes in your reasoning. For example,
well, a windmill will raise water, so why shouldn't it raise an airplane? Perhaps that's what Mr. Jonathan Caldwell thought when he designed and built this contraption, which is being shown to the public for the first time. The mill wheels going round are supposed to represent the flapping wings of a goose. The wheels turn all right, but it just won't leave the ground, not even when they drag it. It moves, though, and that's something. But any auto will go pretty well downhill. A good idea just the same, Professor, and better luck next time.
The premise for that argument might have read, windmills move water, followed by, this airplane is not much heavier than water, therefore this airplane will fly. A logical fallacy. But in your own writing, logical fallacies are not always that obvious. One mistake writers sometimes make is to pose an issue as black or white, as one way or another, but with no other possible alternatives or considerations. For example, the author dedicated his book to Marie. The author's wife's name is Georgette. This is proof that the author was running around. This line of reasoning assumes that there are only two alternatives. If Marie is not the author's wife, she must be his mistress. Actually, there are many other possibilities. Marie could have been his daughter, his mother, sister, good friend, editor, or even the author's secret nickname for his wife. Another problem area in writing the argument is the personal attack. You've probably seen this used in political campaigns.
This has certainly not been clear from your statements in the past, as you have made a number.
Now, are we going to talk about statements in the past If we want to talk about that, my friend, I want to talk about some statements in the past that you have said that you didn't believe in free choice. You didn't believe in pro-choice. Are we going to get back and talk about statements in the past?
When a personal attack is used, the issue becomes confused. No longer does your argument stand on its own merit, and the reader may question your premise. Are you attacking a position or a person? For example, anyone who believes that more money should be spent on AIDS research is a bleeding heart liberal and is contributing to the decay of the American family by endorsing homosexuality. This is obviously attacking a person. Yet some writers believe they can persuade their readers by casting aspersions on anyone who doesn't share their views. But instead of helping the essay, it detracts. If your argument isn't persuasive enough on its own, try getting a different topic rather than resorting to personal attack. Similarly, you may have noticed that when people feel they are losing an argument, they may resort to name-calling or using emotionally charged language and overstate the problem.
Thirdly, I'm a Jewish American. I was recently in the Middle East, and I'm ashamed of the inhumane treatment of the Palestinian people by the Israelis.
Again, the argument no longer rests on its own merits. Some writers try to manipulate their readers by using ambiguous language and vague terminology, leaving the readers wondering what was really meant. For example,
many people are often concerned not only about skills that are being developed, but also about ethical and moral values, or lack of them in society. People often criticize books and movies and try to get them banned. Concerned about this reaction, many lawsuits have been initiated by persons and groups who see actions like this not only as detrimental, but as a violation of our constitutional rights.
Did you follow that? You may have been tempted to get sidetracked from the original premise, which is probably what the writer wanted you to do. But this is not good writing. Both of these devices, ambiguity and overstatement, should be avoided. A similar concern to watch for is using pity rather than logic. Take this premise, for example. The revolutionaries should receive aid from America because hundreds of children are dying daily. It is true, hundreds do die in a civil war. But what about the other side? Are hundreds dying on the other side too? You need to have more substance to your argument for providing aid. What are they fighting for? How will the money be used? There may be many reasons for the U.S. to give aid, but pity sets forth a weak argument. Guilt by association, another trap to avoid. This occurs when you conclude that a person belongs to a certain group because they display some of the characteristics of others in the group. For example,
I'm not going to vote for him because he's just another good-looking Democrat, and he's probably a womanizer just like all the rest of them.
there are many kinds of logical fallacies, but they all boil down to the same problem: faulty reasoning. When you're presenting an argument, you will weaken your case when you are irrational, unreasonable, or when you jump to conclusions based on insufficient information. Writing an argumentative essay is not very different from arguing with your best friend. Stick to the facts. Counter opposing statements with additional evidence that support your side. Avoid name-calling, and steer clear of logical fallacies. If you do this, you will write an effective argumentative essay.
Which of these two statements is arguable? Cigarettes cause serious health risks. Cigarettes should be made illegal. The second sentence, cigarettes should be made illegal, is an opinion and may be argued. The second sentence, therefore, is arguable. In addition to being eyesores, billboard advertisements pose a driving risk. Billboard advertising has become increasingly popular with advertisers. The second sentence in this case is a statement of fact. It may be proved or disproved. The first sentence, on the other hand, is arguable. Many movies contain offensive language. The offensive language contained in movies today adds to the realism which moviegoers pay to see. The first sentence is a statement of fact. Many movies do contain offensive language. The second statement, however, is arguable. The advantages of remaining single outweigh those of being married. More people are choosing to remain single than ever before in history. The first statement represents an opinion and therefore is an arguable statement. Mandatory seatbelt laws are an invasion of privacy. Thousands of lives could be saved each year through the use of seatbelts. The first statement is arguable. The second sentence, on the other hand, is a statement of fact and can be backed with statistics.
This is PBS.